Thank you for joining OTT Talks. As part of our Think Tanks in a Changing Europe series, we're pleased to share a bonus episode with Mathieu Lefèvre, co-founder and CEO of More in Common. In this brief conversation, we explore the dynamics of funding in the marketplace of ideas, including the growing imbalance that is increasingly benefiting the far right. We also discuss the implications of a new law in France and the UK that restricts access to social media platforms for those under 16, and how regulation might evolve to address deeper concerns around attention, agency, and the digital environment shaping today's young citizens. Finally, we question whether traditional political categories of left and right still serve us, or whether we need a new framework to better understand how people relate to politics in today's world. Enjoy.
Yeah, I'm actually curious, Mathieu, because to me, it was happening under the radar. Now, what you mentioned about France, I'm not surprised because France was the other example that I looked at. And it seems that the conservatives are really much more eager into putting their money. I've been actually into putting the money where their ideas sphere is. I'm actually not surprised with that, but I've been also thinking why this is happening and why, let's say, more democratically minded people are hesitant to do that. In a way, in line with your why questioning. But what has been your experience? What are also your explanations for this?
Well, let me start with, so I'll just focus on France here, because I think that France is, on the front line of this battle, and really matters for France, for Europe. So my assessment is that the funding available, all told, for democracy, human rights, pluralism, however you want to describe it, in France in any given year, is about 5 million euros, all told. That's much less than one German Stiftung invests in this work. It's a massive problem. Fact number one. Fact number two, France has more mega billionaires than any country in Europe. There's a couple families in France that are worth more than 100 million euros. One family is worth more than 200 billion euros. So there's no dearth of people with resources. Fact number three, the only people investing at significant level are hard right Christian identitarians. Two names that come up are Vincent Bolloré, net worth probably about in the 10 billion area, who has bought up media properties, every media property he could buy, and is clearly pushing a hard right pro-Le Pen agenda. The second investor who's come on the scene is a guy called Sterrin, who is investing 20, 50 million a year into think tanks, nonprofits, the market of ideas, through a project called Pericles, which is really a French version of Flood the Zone. And he's doing it in a very determined way. And everybody knows it. Profiles have been written about him. He was just condemned for illegal financing of candidates, of National Rally candidates. Like, he's a public figure. And yet, we're still at 5 million on the other side. So what's going on? And I'm endlessly frustrated by the hesitancy of French high net worth individuals to actually step in here. And I think the fact that they hesitate is already a victory for the other side. They hesitate because they think, well, this is going to be a bit controversial. It's going to attract lots of problems. I don't really need this in my life. It's not areas that I want to invest in. I'll continue to give my money to arts and helping the poor and hospitals, etc. All of those things are really important. Arts, saving the poor, feeding the poor and the hungry, hospitals are super important. But I think a small investment of 20 or 50 million euros in the space of fighting for democracy and pluralism in France would be a very good investment, and yet nobody's making it. So it's a source of endless frustration. However, last thing is that there are small signs of hope. New funds have opened in France. One is called La Concorde. One is hosted at Fondation France on democracy. So there is something moving, but we are bringing a butter knife to a bazooka fight, and it's endlessly frustrating to me.
No, I hear you, and frankly, the Fondation de France, which personally I've always lauded as an alternative model, very state-centered, state-sanctioned, but still, actually, you could really have a diminished transactional cost, and also the improve the coordination between efforts. But it has never been strong on democracy. Uh, but what is deep down? I mean, look, I work in and live in Germany, and you mentioned German foundations. They do. I mean, especially Mercator and Bosch. They really invest a lot. There are also some smaller ones in size. It's not a desert, but still, compared to the market, compared to the spending, is really minuscule. Do you think that, sometimes I'm wondering whether these rich people, because many of them come from wealth that spans on average, and that's the average of the DAX 40 index in Germany. The companies are 150 years old on average. Do they think that in the long arc they would survive authoritarianism? And they're okay with it? Or in a more other way of thinking, because I saw that also in Eastern, when I worked in Eastern Europe, another thesis, none of this is proven, of course, that I have, is that also for a lot of individuals in the pro-democracy camp, they are diligent taxpayers. They actually feel that, wait, I'm paying my dues, half of my income goes to the state. Why the state does not give this money? Why shall I pull out the brain? So it's also this belief in the state as a redistribution mechanism that in a way fails us. So at a more ideological level, I mean, and I'm sort of searching for answers. I've not jumped deeper into this, but I have to say, as you said, already the risk averseness and the hesitancy among the pro-democracy actors gives a huge leverage and gives a lot of space to the authoritarian funders and the actors that they support. I don't know. Do you have any pet theory about the
Yeah,
whys?
yeah. So I think there's a short time frame answer and a long time frame answer. The short time frame answer is that the cost of entering this market has been made very high by the far right. If you enter this market, we will troll you on social media. We will make your life impossible. We will, and this kind of harks back to our earlier conversation. The far right really controls the attention economy much better. So any new funder coming into a place like France and investing in pluralism, democracy, freedom is going to get thousands of tweets, and there is a cost to that. High net worth individuals in France value tranquility. So that's the short-term answer. I think the longer-term answer goes to your point about the state. France, much more than Germany, is state-centric. There's a saying in France that it is the state that makes the nation in France. The history of France, etc. So there was a reliance on the state to ensure these functions of pluralism, defending democracy, etc. And that was a very valid deal. We make lots of money, we pay lots of taxes, and you will ensure the defense of democracy, etc. That is no longer the case. The state is no longer able to fulfill these functions, and those are many other functions. France is in an extremely high debt situation. It needs to cut back its debt urgently and find maybe 40, 50 billion a year in savings in its government budget. So it's not going to invest in those things because those things are not seen as priority, and maybe rightly. So I think that we're experiencing a shift away from state dependence, but we're in a void. The state is no longer doing this, but nobody else is really doing this apart from these far right entrepreneurs. So I think the thing to do is to accelerate the shift and to say we're no longer in that state-centric world. Let's go into this new world before it's too late. And one argument that I've tried to make is that, as you know, there are many high net worth individuals in France who are involved in industries like luxury, luxury goods. And I've said to them, we've been invited to brief them, and I've said, that handbag that you sell on the Champs-Élysées for 10,000 euros, do you really think that handbag is, why do people buy that handbag in China and Brazil and Russia and Uzbekistan, etc.? It's because they're buying France. They're buying an image of Paris and chic and all of this stuff. If France becomes a fascist dictatorship, I'm not sure your handbag is worth 10,000 euros anymore. Maybe it's worth 6 or 7. And then they start to listen. And they're like, okay, we cannot have our handbag lose 30% of its value. So there are ways to accelerate the shift.
So there is a traction with this. Oh, I'm actually, that's quite good news in many ways. If there is a traction that brand actually contains, Enrique and I were in Johannesburg for their conference just a couple of weeks ago, and it's a beautiful city that you cannot enjoy because you cannot walk in anything which is like Champs-Élysées. And of course, if you have polarization in the extreme form means exactly that, gated communities, and you cannot sell an image. I have, and this is, I promise, this is the last one because you mentioned social media so many times. We spoke to Paul Morales a couple of months ago, and I really follow a bit Spain, not much, but I follow in a sense that living in Berlin, I feel like why Europe doesn't take more of Spanish thinking, policy thinking. Pedro Sanchez is the only notable leader who actually went out and said, wait, social media, this is actually really bad. What if we do these very radical measures? I also look at the Green Manifesto in the European Parliament, for example, the Greens. If you look at their social platform agenda, and you just implement probably 75%, you don't need it, you will not have most of the problems that you describe. What about ideas in this space in France? Is exactly because you described it, at least one third of the population belongs to this left corner, and those people are not strange to critical thought or criticizing. But where do you see also these ideas when it comes to social media? Also knowing that France or Germany or European countries are not leading in any way or form in that effort, and that maybe the cost of a radical ideas into that space will be lower for them. But I'm just asking you because I also believe for the work of research, you mentioned it well. You said that we're doubling up on the people in the time of machine-centered learning. But to some extent, that machine-centered learning has to have a limit. So, what are your thoughts, and what are the thoughts that you see in the idea spectrum on this?
So I think that I I think that I disagree that Europe isn't leading on this, or France isn't leading on this. So on the narrow issue of regulation of social media, I think that we are weeks away from breakthrough legislation in France at the European level and in the UK probably on essentially preventing anyone under 16 from opening a social media account. I think we're just a few weeks away, and that would be breakthrough legislation. We've worked with Jonathan Haidt, who you may know, who's the kind of foremost specialist on this, very closely. He met with President Macron for an hour to talk about this, and President Macron has announced his intention to put in force that ban. My understanding is that now they're talking about making it EU-wide. So I think on the narrow issue of social media regulation, we are going to make progress. And noting that in the United States, at least, for lots of reasons, at the federal level, at least, they're not able to do that regulation. So I'm less gloomy than you are on that. And by the way, that is an issue that we've done polling on, which is overwhelmingly popular among old, young, urban, rural, far right, far left, middle. Everybody is in favor of that ban, including, very importantly, and we've done research on this, young people themselves. We did focus groups with kids who are like between 16 and 18, and they say, please free us from this prison. This is not good for us. And I think the key danger that they identify as the right one is less on mental health, which was what it was talked about a lot, and more on their inability to focus for more than 5 minutes on anything. I think the destruction of our ability to focus is destroying our future economic competitiveness. For example, we're going to create a workforce that's not able to focus on anything because they've been on social media for 10 years. So I'm less gloomy. Where I'm more worried is that, Europe has this tendency to be very good at regulating and less good at creating. And so, we have a deficit there for sure.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to that piece of legislation. But I'm gonna take advantage that got you here, and I'm sorry if I'm taking a lot of your time, but it's something that I've just been thinking about. And as you were talking about convincing these sort of very high net worth individuals and billionaires, and we use terms like far right, far left, or right and left. But when I actually look at the kind of things they're supporting, um, certainly in Latin America, for instance, it's sort of is conservatism, right? So they're probably putting money into supporting sort of social aspects of society, not necessarily kind of the way the economies run. Um, I wonder if these associations to the left and the right are valid anymore, or are valid in the same ways that they were before. I mean, a lot of the people that are classed as far right, because of maybe their attitudes towards immigration, are the same sort of working class people that in the 70s were against immigration because it was taking manufacturing jobs, right? Um, and does that just make it difficult then for people to say, oh yeah, I'm gonna counter the far right by putting money into these causes? Maybe that's not what this is not how they see themselves, right? They might see themselves as economically sort of conservative in terms of economic policy. They might be a little bit more socially open. So do we need to find different ways of describing people's ideological positions or beliefs, that recognize what you said before, right? That people can have two, three, four ideas in their heads at the same time that may come from what we think are different camps.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, part of the reason why we focus on people's psychology is that in a way it's actually a deeper analysis of how people view the world than left or right, because left or right are quite, as you say, they're kind of moving notions sometimes. And for example, people's voting patterns are quite volatile, but their personality and the way we describe their personality is a lot less volatile than that. And I agree with you that the typology of far right can be a bit misleading. So, if you think of Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen, there are things that both of them do that are sort of economic populist measures that you could say are kind of left wing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are others. So yeah, I think that's right. I think one key dimension that we learn from this people-centric lens is that the proportion of people for whom political identity is a central marker of their life, of their identity, is a minority. We tend to think of the world as divided between right and left, but the world is really divided between people who care about politics and people who really don't. They just care about other things. So that's very important. Now, in terms of like motivating counter forces, I think motivating against the far right is maybe not a good tactic. You're right, Enrique, I think. But there are certain things that you can motivate people about. Corruption. I mean, I think if there was one word that I would use to describe Donald Trump and his regime, it's corrupt. They're corrupt. And you can appeal to high net worth individuals and to say, like, corruption is not good. We know corruption is not good. Flaunting the rule of law, disrespecting the rights of minorities. So it's less saying, oh, the far right is bad, but it's saying more like these kinds of regimes have these attributes: corrupt, flaunting the rule of law, disrespecting the rule. That might be a more appealing
And they come
proposition.
from anywhere. They can come from anywhere. They can come from any ideological backgrounds, from any
Absolutely.
any
Yeah.
sense,
And the threat of authoritarianism is not a right-wing thing. It's a left-wing thing, as we've seen in, parts of Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, the Soviet Union, increasingly, threats of it in places like Colombia or maybe Mexico in parts, etc. So it's absolutely, it's very important. And it's particularly important to say that to high net worth audiences we want to invest in this space.
Yeah, there's a very good book that I always go back to called The Argument by Matt Bai. And he talks about how there was a moment when the Democratic Party kind of lost the White House to George Bush, and then to that George Bush's son, right? Through that period, they did a bit of study about how the Republicans had won the White House, and they kind of calculated that they spent like $1 billion in getting the White House, and there was a clear strategy to do it. And so this guy went around convincing Democratic funders to fund a sort of a counter campaign. But there I could see, when I was thinking about that book, there's a clear group, right? You're convincing that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are two separate things. But in this case, often the idea, the battle of ideas is not necessarily one side against the other, right? As you say, there are bits of what people believe that are being contested, but not the whole package, right? They're not actual groups, difficult groups. Anyway, we've taken a lot of your time, but this is really interesting, and we continue to be fascinated by how our context changes and what organizations like yours and other more traditional think tanks can and probably should be doing about it. So thank you very much for giving us this extra time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.